This is a University of Otago podcast.
Very much, Colin, for the warm introduction, and I'd like to add my thanks to those of Andy in giving me the opportunity to be here. I'd like to thank Genetics Otago, Sophia, and the Faculty of Law for staging this event and giving me the opportunity to present my part of the story. Andy has set, I think, a wonderful pace. I feel jam-packed between two international speakers, and Ron, I'm looking forward to your contribution too. I'll come to you as a clinician, as a physician with a very clear stance on where I feel we need to be drawing the line, but I'll also be a little bit reflective, reminiscent of some of the experiences that I've had as an athlete and an observer of many of these things over the last 40 years, because, as Andy so said and put it so well, the rules of engagement have changed and will continue to change, and we must be aware of that. I'm going to begin by making a few personal assumptions. I am an advocate of the traditional model of sport, the Athenian vision of the biggest, the strongest, the fastest being the winner, and of course Citius Altius Fortius is the Olympic motto, swifter, higher and stronger. I do believe in the legacy of good genes. I also acknowledge the spirit of fair play, and I am, as a physician, very concerned about athlete well-being. You see, there is the small question of genes, and there are people in this room far more equipped and better trained than I to speak about this, but in case you haven't noticed, Andy, we weren't born equal, and you and I would have struggled to make the college basketball team, and if you were like me in the rugby team, or did you play soccer?
Hey, volleyball.
Volleyball. Well done, well done. I was a scrum half. There was no way I could play in the second row. I just didn't have the genetic endowment for that. So some would say elite sport does favour the brave and discriminate against the less endowed, but my argument is, shouldn't we leave it that way? You see, there are a number of gifted, and they have left us their gifts, whether it's the art of Michelangelo, the nocturnes of Chopin, the sonnets of Shakespeare, or the boot of Carter. There are genetically endowed people who represent the whole world of performance, and not necessarily just in sport. And I think for a moment I'd like to give my take on what I consider to be athlete enhancement. And it is born of a common concept, I believe, and one that I adhere to, of realising one's full physical and psychological potential, which, as I've said, is governed by our endowment genetically, but can be promoted through research-informed science and evidence-based medical practice. And there are a number of strategies that we have traditionally applied to enhancing the performance of athletes who may or may not have come under our care. We know about the technical skills associated with good coaching. Andy touched on a couple of very important points when he mentioned the change in the shape of the javelin. When people, the big bulky javelin throwers, are throwing it too far, the centre of gravity of the javelin was changed. It became a question of technique rather than brute strength. Many people who study the science of cricket and batting will know that in the past some of the world's greatest batsmen have not been 2 metres tall and 120 kilograms in weight, but they have been men and women of shorter stature with impeccable technique and timing. We know that training will encourage people to consider the skills, the speed, the strength and the stamina that is the requirement for elite sport. And of course there's elements of physiological adaptation to training overload and the like. Nutrition in sport really addresses energy requirements on one hand and fluid and electrolyte replacements post-exercise. There's nothing magic or mythical about good sports nutrition, yet the sport nutraceutical industry is worth billions of dollars in the United States. And I know for a fact that the United States swimming team at the last Olympic Games was excreting the most expensive urine in the world. Finally, we enhance the performance and maximise the potential of athletes by administering good medical clinical care. Colleagues in physiotherapy help us with rehabilitation techniques, and we all work together in injury prevention. And you see, at the end of the day, sport assumes a very, very important part in society, and our national identity is often tightly enmeshed, woven, as some would say, into our social fabric. I heard it said recently that the outcome of our New Zealand election in November will depend or will reflect our success in the Rugby World Cup, and that if Richie McCaw and the boys come home with the cup, then John Key is probably going to be Prime Minister again. Mark my words, you didn't hear it here first, I heard it somewhere else, but I think there is an ideology out there, there's a concept that sport, and to Kiwis, who traditionally have been described as punching well above their weight in the international sporting arena, do place a huge amount of impact on the success of our sporting icons. But we weren't the first to consider this as an important element, important identifier. And for those of you that haven't ever seen it, you could probably download it or capture snaps of it. The film by Leni Riefenstahl of the 1936 Berlin Olympics is reported to be the greatest Olympic film ever, capturing what was really a Nazi propaganda show. But this was something which sports historians have reflected on as saying was one of the significant examples of sport and national identity. There are many more. When it comes, therefore, a question, or becomes a question of asking whether or not I should consider using drugs in sport to enhance my performance, there are many tempting carrots hanging about for a young athlete. The personal kudos, the financial reward and sponsorship and endowment, the celebrity rock star status of our All Blacks. I was up at the Moana pool last Sunday morning having my twice weekly splash around in the veterans lane, and the Crusaders, hot from their success at Carisbrook the night before, were having a bit of a wind down prior to flying to London this week to play at Twickenham. And the whole Moana pool turned their eyes on Sonny Bill Williams, Dan Carter and the team. And so I think celebrity status, certainly rock star status, was seen in action there at the Moana pool. I even felt quite chuffed that Sonny Bill Williams was swimming in the lane beside me, and I beat him. The other argument is, of course, that most athletes recognise the fact that their life in sport and their potential to make this their professional career lasts perhaps a decade, in some cases less, sometimes a little bit more. Now, when it comes to the question of misusing drugs, and this is the next point of some contention, I stick my line in the sand, or make my mark in the sand, by saying that when we apply a therapeutic substance for other than its recognised clinical purpose or indication, then I believe we are misusing a drug. This is open to contention, and Andy and I have a little discussion about some of the applications of this, but in general terms, the principles that I adhere to and respect are those. And when it comes to using drugs for other than clinical and therapeutic purposes, we have to recognise that there is a culture, there is an audience out there. There are people who feel that bigger is better, and people for whom the use of anabolic androgenic steroids captures our imagination. Now, I don't consider bodybuilding to be a sport. I'm not quite sure or how I categorise it, but nonetheless, they provide an avenue for a number of people. One of these shots has been photoshopped a little bit, doctored up. You can choose which one. And at the end of the day, and there have been some comments made about the issues of drugs and who administers and adjudicates and sets the rules. Well, of course, it's the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, who at their meeting in Copenhagen in 2003 made the very clear declaration that they were there to protect and recognise the health and equality of the athlete in a spirit of internationally deterring the use of doping in sport and harmonising this. So not only do they make the statement, but they administer the testing through a set of accredited laboratories. They set the international standards, they create the list of prohibited substances, and they administer the sanctioning process. The WADA Code reflects this international accord between governments and sport, and there have been some very powerful signatories to the code. The governments, represented by generally their ministers for sport, but representing the nation's government, together with the international federations, have been signatories to both the Copenhagen Declaration and subsequently the code itself. And in 2005, at the 33rd General Conference of UNESCO, an international convention was adopted, a convention against doping in sport, now ratified by 156 member states and reported to be the most rapidly adopted, accepted, ratified convention ever in the history of UNESCO. So there was some significant thought out there that the governments needed to come to the party. And we in New Zealand have an outpost, if you will, of WADA. Drug Free Sport New Zealand is our national anti-doping organisation concerned with maintaining that drug-free environment for athletes in New Zealand. Comments have already been made about the criteria that WADA apply to a substance before it's considered to be included on the prohibited list. And as Andy quite correctly said, you tick 2 of the 3 boxes and there's a chance that that substance will be on the list. I want to continue the thoughts related to sport and national identity by reflecting on what happened in the former East Germany during particularly the 60s, 70s, but probably on into the 80s as well, where in this very interesting book, if any of you have access to it, Faust's Goal by Stephen Ungerleider, and captured by Cole in a wonderful paper that he did following the unification of Germany, talking about GDR athletes as missionaries. There was no better platform in international arena for the GDR to pronounce how well they were running the country by having the young men and women that represented them at the Olympic Games coming back with truckloads of gold medals. In a country the population of Australia were winning more gold medals than any other nation at the Olympics during that period. However, the downside to this, and subsequently revealed upon the demolishing of the Berlin Wall and the unification of Germany, it was found that drug enhancement was also a very important part of their sports science and their talent identification recognition programs. When I was a medical student and interested in sports science and a career in sports medicine, East Germany was the place that everybody focused on for the research, the sports science, the absolute pinnacle of commitment to the athlete. Muscle biopsies to determine whether or not you were a fast or a slow twitcher, talent recognition programs, children plucked, I think unethically, out of the family confines and thrown into sporting kindergartens. It didn't ring particularly comfortably true with us here, but nonetheless that was what the East Germans were doing, and then supplementing their development with drugs. Raging libidos, unnatural hair growth, depression, birth defects, heart failure and tumours were the consequences reported subsequently from the long-term use of high-dose anabolic agents. And so we get to the point, and it's a point I guess that we're at here too, in terms of one of the arguments, why should we worry? Let's have it open slather. Let's have the so-called well-popularised dual league, where in one camp you have the drug-enhanced performers like Andy's guys beating the hell out of each other, no holds barred, no rules. You just get in there and you demonstrate your prowess, taking whatever you want to take, as opposed to the other, somewhat we might consider more conservative approach to natural athleticism and performance enhancement along the lines that I've already mentioned. So why do we worry? Well, I believe we worry for three reasons. I believe that the consequences, particularly of drug misuse, and I'll say something about gene doping and those technologies later, I believe that these arguments invoke concerns for whatever we might use to describe the ethical, moral, fair play, cheating aspect to it all. And you ask athletes whether or not they want to compete against cheats, people who are not abiding by the rules, and the vast majority of them will say no. Then there is the legality. If you come and ask me if I can prescribe anabolic steroids for you because you want to enter the local bodybuilding competition and you want to be bigger and stronger and more aggressive than ever, the truth of the matter is I can't. As a registered medical practitioner, I'm in contravention of the Medical Council requirements, and I could suffer the penalty of being struck off and also being charged with the misuse of a medication. And then thirdly, but perhaps most importantly, there are other health implications. There have been deaths, well recorded, well reported, deaths at the Olympic Games, the 1960 death of the Danish cyclist Knut Jensen in the road race, thought at the time to be as a result of dehydration and hyperthermia, and then subsequently at post-mortem found to be in part due to the excessive use of amphetamines. Soon after that, in the Tour de France, Tommy Simpson, the British cyclist, died in very similar circumstances. There were concerns for the way that Flojo, the darling of the 1988 Olympic Games, the American track and field pin-up girl, 10 years later died under rather strange circumstances, thought to be the consequence of prolonged use of probably human growth hormone, for which there was no legitimised, legally defensible laboratory test at the time. The test to determine whether this was endogenous, natural or exogenous. Flojo was dead 10 years after her gold medal winning performances. There were the young cyclists in the Netherlands and Belgium who died as a consequence of their experimentation with erythropoietin, EPO, the drug that manufactures red blood cells. Red blood cells, of course, linked to oxygen, provide the currency for energy for working muscles. And these young men in the experimental phases used too much EPO. Their blood viscosity increased to the point where they were having strokes and heart attacks and dying on the roadside. So the health implications are there, and then there's a list of others that we'll touch on. Anabolic androgenic steroids carry the risks of premature cessation of bone growth, the fusion of growth plates, premature stunting of growth, alterations to the lipid profile, the increased risk of coronary heart disease, altered moods, suicides, post-use of high doses of anabolic steroids for long periods of time. I've had to give evidence at 2 coroner's inquests over the last 10 years for young men in New Zealand who have come off anabolic steroids and who became so depressed that they took their own lives. the whole raft of dysfunction that occurs in terms of menstrual disorder, the loss of femininity in young women taking these drugs. And then there's the ongoing risks of malignancy of liver, kidney. EPO, as I've mentioned, increasing blood viscosity, carrying risks of heart attacks and strokes and heart failure. The stimulants, as we've mentioned, the cause of death in athletes for whom natural mechanisms that ought to tell us to switch off are abolished and overridden. In many cases, there have been athletes who have tried the use of stimulants and found that they've developed cardiac arrhythmias, which are early signals that you ought to stand back and rethink your use of this medication, but in some cases they can proceed on to fatal arrhythmia. I want to jump now to another area in which I've had some exposure and experience in the last decade in WADA, and that's the application of the use of prohibited substances for genuine medical reasons, so that it doesn't mean that because you're an athlete who suffers from asthma and need to use inhaled corticosteroids or inhaled beta-2 agonists to treat your asthma, or you're an insulin-dependent diabetic, that you cannot compete. You can compete. And athletes with these conditions are permitted to compete, provided they apply respect for certain guidelines that must be understood and administered by their medical advisors. At all times we prioritise athlete health and safety. That comes first before the sporting event. So there is a retrospective clause. If suddenly an athlete is admitted to hospital and requires to be treated with narcotic analgesics, to have some prohibited substance administered in the course of urgent medical care, then a retrospective TUE is awarded, provided the evidence is given and kept. So we say to the high-profiled athletes on our national registered testing pool, athletes who are subjected to international federation regulations, when you go to the doctor and you are required to receive treatment, the doctor should know you are an athlete subject to possible testing, and you must introduce the concept of therapeutic use exemption. So the responsibility resides with the athlete patient, but also with the treating physician. And there are strict clinical criteria. Colin made mention of the widespread use of methylphenidate, and a condition that Ritalin is used to treat, of course, is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And this is not endemic, but it's relatively common in many athletes. Provided evidence can be shown that they have been appropriately investigated, they have a history, and the clinical criteria for the diagnosis of ADHD have been adhered to, then they will be permitted to use methylphenidate. But it's not a question of going to your friendly family doctor and saying, hey, I need a little bit of Ritalin, I'm competing next week, and then producing that as the evidence. That will not hold water and will not meet the rigid requirements for TUE exemption. And over the last few years we have specifically addressed conditions for which prohibited substances may be required. Chronic inflammatory bowel disease invokes the use of systemic corticosteroids. Hypogonadism, of course, requires testosterone supplementation. ADHD and narcolepsy will require the chronic and profound use of stimulants like methylphenidate. Acute asthma requires corticosteroids, and of course insulin-dependent diabetes demands insulin. I jump on now to 2 or 3 case studies which reflect things that have happened along the way. And of course the classic is that of Ben Johnson, the gold medalist in Seoul in 1988, who was first by the Canadian media reported as a Canadian gold medalist, then over the subsequent 24 to 48 hours, whereas Clive James said in a tongue-in-cheek report, they found traces of urine in his anabolic steroids. He was full to the gunnels of stanozolol, a very potent anabolic androgenic agent, administered, I might say, by his Dr. Jamie Astafan, and also encouraged by his coach, Charlie Francis, both of whom were in for a clip of the ticket because Ben Johnson was reported to be going back to Canada to receive a $10 million sponsorship deal. He was a Canadian first and a Canadian Jamaican, a Jamaican immigrant, and finally the Canadians disowned him, and rightly so. The Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, ironically, had one of the most remarkable educational programs in place at the time, and they were as dismayed as the rest of us were. During the 2006 Tour de France, you're all aware that Floyd Landis became the first winner to have to return his medal. There was laboratory evidence of the use of exogenous testosterone. The laboratory showed unequivocally the presence of exogenous testosterone by a process known as isotope ratio mass spectrometry, a very sophisticated means by which you can determine that this is not natural testosterone, and this was not, his elevated testosterone, epitestosterone ratio was not of a physiological cause. And then, of course, there was the rise and fall of the great Marion Jones, who won all those gold medals in Sydney in 2000, became involved in the Belco Laboratory affair where the first ever designer steroid was produced, a substance that was an iteration of gestrinone, a very powerful, potent anabolic agent used to treat menstrual dysfunction, menorrhagia, heavy, painful periods. It had its clinical place. What the Belco laboratory folk did was just tweaked it slightly and turned it into tetrahydrogestrinone, which literally flew under the radar and was not detected at Sydney. But by Athens, an analytical process had been determined and it was on the list. Marion Jones, meanwhile, at the Belco laboratory investigation, declared that she had not been involved in this. She perjured herself, which is not a good thing to do in the legal system of the United States of America. She subsequently publicly confessed and admitted that she had told a little white lie. She was in prison for 6 months. She lost her Olympic gold medals and was struck off the Olympic record. 3 other women received their gold medals by post, but it didn't seem to have the same ring, did it? You know, not standing up on the dais and receiving the true acknowledgement. I jump now to gene doping, and you're probably all aware of the wider definition which employs or applies this to the misuse of genes and genetic elements. Much has been said, and I'm sure much will continue to be said by others better equipped than I to talk about what's publicly reported as genetic luck, natural talent, gift, or the wise choice of parents. And this is not a new model. This has been well publicised in the Belgian Blue. This beast here, bred for obvious reasons, is an indication that things are happening. And through gene transfer technology, again, this is the Reader's Digest version for you. It's about as deep as my understanding is of the technology, because it is a science, it is a specialist area of research. But essentially what we're doing is transferring genetic information through a vector, most commonly a virus. And first thought of as being a wonderful opportunity for us to develop a capacity for improving health and health outcomes with a goal. However, in the course of determining what might help people and make them well and better, implications for gene doping in sport became very obvious. And this study done last century on primates who were injected with the virus carrying a gene for EPO, that hormone I referred to earlier that manufactures red blood cells, shows very quickly and very clearly the potential benefits that you could invest in an athlete who had the increased propensity for EPO production, transport of red blood cells. So too, gene therapy with insulin-like growth factor, the effect on muscle in terms of muscle growth, hypertrophy, and the mouse model here demonstrates that, the gene for IGF-1. Similarly, myostatin, the control gene for muscle growth. On one side you see the normal mouse, and then the mouse lacking the myostatin gene, and more significantly shown here. So imagine that to be a human, not the myostatin mouse. The evidence is there. The potential for misuse in sport. And then finally, another area of research. Again, these things have been around for a long, long time, but this one reflecting how increased vascularity, which of course would enhance the transportation of blood and oxygen, the vascular endothelial growth factor. And these diagrams, these illustrations here rather, demonstrate the proliferation of vascularity, which could be used to enhance athletic performance and have a very strong potential for gene doping. Now, I know this is Ron's area, and I'm not even going to go there, but I just leave you with that vision of designer babies as being perhaps the athletes of the future. So in summary, I quite unashamedly stand before you and say that I accept the genetic lottery. I chose my parents as wisely as I could. I didn't realise that I was predestined to inherit the propensity to coronary artery disease that I did. Made me realise what genetic endowment really meant. I've always been a non-smoker. My blood pressure's been good. I've tried to continue to exercise. I've done everything by the book. Like all good physicians, I try to practice what I preach. And almost to the year, this time last year, I ended up in coronary intensive care with 90% of my right coronary artery occluded, and I now am the proud owner of 3 stents. And it made me realise just how important that genetic endowment was. I tried to work on the factors that I could influence, but I couldn't override the genes. I am in total opposition to an open-door drugs policy for sport, so I do not subscribe to the two-league scenario. I do, as a former athlete and as one who tries to understand where athletes today are coming from, and particularly the New Zealand athletes that I have been privileged to travel with and get to know well, I do have respect for the code of fair play. But above all else, as a physician with my Hippocratic oath tucked firmly in my back pocket, I do believe that the preservation of athlete health and well-being is what should motivate me, and I hope motivate other physicians to keep sport as clean as we can. Thank you.